The monster under the shed. It was a dark, blustery evening at Knackford Station. The Fat Controller had closed very early on account of the bad weather. The engines were waiting for their signal to return to their shed. They were really bored, but then Thomas suggested something. Maybe one of us should tell a story to pass the time, he said to the other engines. And the other engines were pleased with Thomas's idea. Then James volunteered something. I have a perfect story for tonight, he volunteered, and all the engines waited and listened to James' ghost story. A long time ago, James began. There was a brave blue engine who was always eager to help. But one day, that all changed. Blue engine? The station master asked one night. Would you go to the end of the tracks to pick a coach that was left behind and brought over here on the station? Of course, the brave vegan engine replied, and he set off to the dark, foggy night. But then by the time the little blue engine reached the end of the tracks, and the fog was so thick you could hardly see anything. I'll just have to wait till morning. This fog is so thick I can hardly see anything, said the engine from himself. He saw a little wooden shed, and he set off to an old shed for the night. The other engines were starting to think that story was a little bit boring, but that was all changed when then James kept going telling his story. Late that night, the little blue engine awoke to a noise coming from below the shed. He opened his eyes and saw long fingers reaching from the floored holes, and then they touched it from him from the buffers. He said there was a monster under his shed. Terrified, the little blue engine raced out of the shed and went to the deep, thick fog with the horrible engine-eating monster chased with him through the fog. Then the engines were shaking. They were frightened about the monster. Then Percy asked for James nervously.
But what happened next?
Asked Percy, really frightened. That, little Percy, is where the story ends. No one ever heard from the little blue engine ever again,
But
said Percy again.
what about the monster?
But then Gordon just chuckled. Don't be silly, little Percy, he said. It's only just an old story. The points were changed, and all the engines set off to the shed. But Percy was still thinking about the monster, and then he whispered to Thomas.
If the story was true, what if the monster is out there somewhere right now?
Thomas was really annoyed about that. Don't be such a scaredy cat, Percy. This is just a story. There's no such thing as monsters. Later that night, all the angels were now sleeping in their sheds, nice and comfortable. One day they heard a rattle coming from Percy's shed. Percy got scared, and then he screamed,
Good, Thomas, help! There's a monster under my shed!
But suddenly, James appeared rolling with laughter. He was shouting at the truck full of them, scrapping, and then was rattling from behind from Percy's shed, making those weird sounds. James laughed loudly and sang, "Ha ha! I'm the monster! I'm the monster!" But Percy was feeling really foolish from himself. But Edward and Henry felt bad for poor Percy. It's okay, little Percy, said Edward. Sometimes good imagination, said Henry, bring bad thoughts. But then later that night, Thomas was awake for a strange noise. It was coming from under his shed. Then Thomas said, "It must be James again. James, can you please stop? Nobody falls for your pranks again." But then when Thomas looked to James' shed, James was sound asleep. Thomas looked to the other sheds. All of the engines were sleeping there. Thomas got terrified. If it is not James, then maybe I really do have a monster under my shed. And he stayed awake all night just to be safe. Thomas was awfully tired when he could meet up with Brisbane the next morning. Did you hear any weird sounds coming from under your shed, Percy? Said Thomas, really tired, almost closing his eyes. Well, after Jane's silly prank, said Percy. Then Thomas was feeling foolish to be awake all night. By the end of the day, Thomas was collecting animal barbells and deciding that he'd meet up with Henry. You look like you need some special coat, Thomas, Henry said to Thomas. No, Henry. I'm just tired, that's all. I have a really bad night last night. Then James rolled past Henry and Thomas, laughing loudly, pulling the express. What's the matter, Thomas? He said. What's it keeping you awake all night? He set off laughing loudly. Later that evening, Thomas was coming back to his shed. But then when he was passing to the other engines, the other engines were telling stories again. Thomas didn't want to hear any story. He just went down back to his shed, no fuss. Sometime that night, Thomas was hearing the same sound from last night, and the noise was back, and there were definitely coming from under Thomas' shed. Who's there? Said Thomas, whispering scaredly and really frightened. Came the answer. Go away, monster! Get out! Said Thomas, and he closed his eyes tight. But then he heard other noises. Then Thomas decided, I will surely wake up the engines that will save me from the monster. Right? But the engines didn't stir. He said, he's outside the door. Then Thomas shut down his door. He's definitely outside of the door. Help, Gordon, said Thomas, but only the monster heard him. Then Thomas's door began to rattle into the ancients. Bang, 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 said the sound. It's not windy. It's just a wind. It's not a windy day, but it's maybe the wind. Or maybe it's the monster trying to get in, said Thomas. Then, suddenly, the banging stopped. Thomas was too terrified to move. Slowly moved one wheel and another, peering to the dark, and there it was! The horrible, engine-eating monster. Thomas could see his weird, yellow, glowing eyes into the dark under his tracks. Thomas could stand no more. He whistled loudly, waking up all the engines, and he screams, Ah! Help! Help, everybody! Help! Help me! Save me from the monster! He whistled loudly and closed his eyes tight. All the engines were scared, but then Gordon chuckled. Thomas, open your eyes. What are you laughing at, Gordon? There's a monster outside of my shed. He wants to kill me. Not anymore, said Gordon. Now the monster's inside of your shed. Then Thomas slowly opened one eye and looked down, and then he saw a hedgehog. Thomas was surprised. I was afraid of a tiny little hedgehog. All the engines laughed. Even Thomas laughed with them. The sun was setting up, and all the engines were talking. Then Gordon spoke to Thomas. Yes, you have a good imagination, he said, but I think yours is much better, said Gordon. I think you're right, he said. It's the only thing in the world what turns a little cute and innocent hedgehog into a big, scary